Now we shall discuss the Clause 8, Operation of ISO 9001-2015. The subclause 8 operation has further 7 subclauses that are 8.1 Operational Planning and Control, 8.2 Requirements for Products and Services, 8.3 Design and Development of Products and Services, 8.4 Control of Externally Provided Processes, Products and Services, 8.5 Production and Service Provision, 8.6 Release of Products and Services, 8.7 Control of Non-conforming Outputs. We shall now begin with the subclause 8.1 Operational Planning and Control. According to this subclause 8.1, an organization is required to plan, implement, and control the processes needed to meet the requirements for the provision of products and services, and also to implement the actions determined in Clause 6 of the standard by determining the requirements for the products and services. Clause 8.1 says that organizations must plan, implement, and control the processes needed to meet the requirements by establishing criteria for the processes and the acceptance of products and services. Standard under this subclause 8.1 states that an organization is required to plan, implement, and control the processes needed to meet the requirements by determining the resources needed to achieve conformity to the product and service requirements. Clause 8.1 also states that the organization must plan, implement, and control the processes by implementing control of the processes in accordance with the criteria to meet the requirements. Organization is required to plan, implement, and control the processes by determining, maintaining, and retaining documented information or to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned, and also to demonstrate the conformity of products and services to their requirements. The output of this planning shall be suitable for the organization's operations. Further, the subclause 8.1 of ISO 9001-2015 specifies that the organization is required to control planned changes and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking action to mitigate and adverse effects as necessary. Lastly, this clause says that the organization is required to ensure that outsourced processes are controlled. Coming to the subclause 8.2 now. Requirements for products and services. The subclause 8.2.1 Customer communication states that communication with customers is required to include providing information relating to the product and services and handling inquiries, contracts or orders, including changes, if any. The clause 8.2.1 specifies that communication with customers is required to obtain customer feedback relating to products and services and also the customer complaints. According to this clause, communication must include handling or controlling customers properly and establishing specific requirements for contingency actions when relevant. Let's talk about the next subclause, that is 8.2.2, determining the requirements for products and services. Subclause 8.2.2 states that when determining the requirements for the products and services to be offered to customers, the organization is required to ensure that the requirements for the products and services are defined, including any applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, and those which are considered necessary by the organization. This subclause further says that the organization is required to ensure that it can meet the claims for the products and services it offers. Now coming to clause 8.2.3, review of the requirements for products and services. The subclause 8.2.3.1 specifies that the organization is required to ensure that it has the ability to meet the requirements for products and services to be offered to customers. The organization is required to conduct a review before committing to supply products and services to a customer. The review is to include requirements specified by the customer, including the requirements for delivery and post-delivery activities. The review must include requirements not stated by the customer, but necessary for the specified or intended use when known. The subclause 8.2.3.1 says that the organization is required to conduct a review to include requirements specified by the organization, statutory and regulatory requirements applicable to the products and services, and contract or order requirements differing from those previously expressed. Coming to the subclause 8.2.3.2 now. This subclause 8.2.3.2 of ISO 9001 states that the organization is required to retain documented information as applicable on the results of the review and on any new requirements for the products and services. Let's talk about subclause 8.2.4, changes to requirements for products and services. This clause 8.2.4 specifies that the organization is required to ensure that the relevant documented information is amended and that relevant persons are made aware of the changed requirements when the requirements for products and services are changed. Coming to the clause 8.3, design and development of products and services now. The subclause 8.3.1 general states that the organization is required to establish, implement and maintain a design and development process that is appropriate to ensure the subsequent provision of products and services. Let us discuss the subclause 8.3.2, design and development planning. Subclause 8.3.2 of ISO 9001-2015 states that in determining the stages and controls for design and development, the organization is required to consider the nature, duration and complexity of the design and development activities, the required process stages including applicable design and development reviews, the required design and development verification and validation activities, the responsibilities and authorities involved in the design and development process, the internal and external resource needs for the design and development of products and services, the need to control interfaces between persons involved in the design and development process, the need for involvement of customers and users in the design and development process, the requirements for subsequent provision of products and services, the level of control expected for the design and development process by customers and other relevant interested parties, and the documented information needed to demonstrate that design and development requirements have been met. Let's talk about 8.3.3, design and development inputs. This subclause says that the organization must determine the requirements essential for the specific type of products and services to be designed and developed. The organization is required to consider functional and performance requirements, information derived from previous similar design and development activities, statutory and regulatory requirements, standards or codes of practice that the organization has committed to implement, potential consequences of failure due to the nature of the products and services. As per this subclause 8.3.3, inputs must be adequate for design and development purposes. It must be complete and unambiguous. The conflicting design and development inputs must be resolved. Subclause 8.3.3, covering the mandatory documentation requirements, says that the organization is required to retain documented information on design and development inputs. Coming to subclause 8.3.4 now, design and development controls. This subclause 8.3.4 of ISO 9001 specifies that the organization is required to apply controls to the design and development process to ensure that the results to be achieved are defined, reviews are conducted to evaluate the ability of the results of design and development to meet requirements. Verification activities are conducted to ensure that the design and development outputs meet the input requirements. Validation activities are conducted to ensure that the resulting products and services meet the requirements for the specified application or intended use. Any necessary actions are taken on problems determined during the reviews or verification and validation activities. Documented information of these activities is retained. Lastly, under a note, subclause 8.3.4 states that design and development reviews, verification, and validation have distinct purposes. They can be conducted separately or in any combination as is suitable for the products and services of the organization. Let me talk about subclause 8.3.5 now. Design and development outputs. As per this subclause, the organization is required to ensure that design and development outputs meet the input requirements, are adequate for the subsequent processes for the provision of products and services, include or reference monitoring and measuring requirements as appropriate and acceptance criteria. Specify the characteristics of the products and services that are essential for their intended purpose and their safe and proper provision. Finally, this subclause 8.3.5 states that the organization is required to retain documented information on design and development outputs for meeting the requirements of the standard. Coming to subclause 8.3.6, design and development changes. According to this subclause 8.3.6 of ISO 9001, the organization is required to identify, review, and control changes made during or subsequent to the design and development of products and services, to the extent necessary to ensure that there is no adverse impact on conformity to requirements. This clause says that the organization is required to retain documented information on design and development changes and the results of reviews, the authorization of the changes, and the actions taken to prevent adverse impacts. Now let's talk about the clause 8.4, control of externally provided processes, products, and services. Let me explain the subclause 8.4.1 general. According to this subclause, the organization is required to ensure that externally provided processes, products, and services conform to requirements. Clause 8.4.1 states that the organization is required to determine the controls to be applied to externally provided processes, products, and services when products and services from external providers are intended for incorporation into the organization's own products and services. This subclause 8.4.1 states that the organization is required to determine the controls to be applied to externally provided processes, products, and services when products and services are provided directly to the customer by external providers on behalf of the organization. The subclause also specifies that the organization is required to determine the controls to be applied to externally provided processes, products, and services when a process or part of a process is provided by an external provider as a result of a decision by the organization. The standard through this subclause 8.4.1 specifies that the organization is required to determine and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring of performance, and re-evaluation of external providers based on their ability to provide processes or products and services in accordance with the requirements. Lastly, this subclause talks about the mandatory documentation requirements. The clause says that the organization is required to retain documented information of these activities and any necessary actions arising from the evaluations. Now coming to subclause 8.4.2, type and extent of control. This subclause 8.4.2 states that the organization is required to ensure that externally provided processes, products, and services do not adversely affect the organization's ability to consistently deliver conforming products and services to its customers. According to this clause, the organization must ensure that externally provided processes remain within the control of its quality management system. Subclause 8.4.2 states that the organization must define both the controls and it intends to apply on an external provider and those it intends to apply to the resulting output. According to this subclause, the organization must take into consideration the potential impact of the externally provided processes, products, and services on the organization's ability to consistently meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. As per Clause 8.4.2, organizations must consider the effectiveness of the controls applied by the external provider. Clause says that the organization must determine the verification or other activities necessary to ensure that the externally provided processes, products, and services meet the requirements. Let's discuss the subclause 8.4.3. Information for external providers. This subclause specifies that the organization is required to ensure the adequacy of requirements prior to their communication to the external provider. The organization must communicate to external providers its requirements for the processes, products, and services to be provided. As per this subclause, an organization is required to ensure the adequacy of requirements prior to their communication to the external provider for the approval of products and services, methods, processes, and equipment, and the release of products and services. Subclause 8.4.3 of ISO 9001 says that the organization is required to ensure the competence, including any required qualification of persons and the external provider's interactions with the organization. As per this subclause 8.4.3, the organization is required to ensure that control and monitoring of the external provider's performance is to be applied by the organization. According to this subclause, organization is required for verification or validation activities that the organization or its customers intend to perform at the external provider's premises. Let's talk about subclause 8.5. Production and service provision. The subclause 8.5.1, control of production and service provision, states that the organization is required to implement production and service provision under controlled conditions. Controlled conditions are required to include, as applicable, the availability of documented information that defines the characteristics of the products to be produced, the services to be provided, or the activities to be performed. Controlled conditions are also required to include the results to be achieved. Subclause 8.5.1 specifies that the organization must include the availability and use of suitable monitoring and measuring resources in controlled conditions. The organization is required to ensure that controlled conditions include the implementation of monitoring and measurement activities at appropriate stages to verify that criteria for control of processes or outputs and acceptance criteria for products and services have been met. This subclause 8.5.1 states that the controlled conditions must comprise the use of suitable infrastructure and environment for the operation of processes. The conditions must include the appointment of competent persons, including any required qualification. Organization must ensure that controlled conditions include the validation and periodic revalidation of the ability to achieve planned results of the processes for production and service provision, where the resulting output cannot be verified by subsequent monitoring or measurement. Subclause 8.5.1 specifies that controlled conditions are required to contain the implementation of actions to prevent human error and also the implementation of release, delivery, and post-delivery activities. Coming to subclause 8.5.2, identification and traceability. According to subclause 8.5.2 of ISO 9001, the organization is required to use suitable means to identify outputs when it is necessary to ensure the conformity of products and services. To meet the requirement of the standard 9001, this subclause says that the organization is required to identify the status of outputs with respect to monitoring and measurement requirements throughout production and service provision. Subclause 8.5.2 states that the organization is required to control the unique identification of the outputs when traceability is a requirement and shall retain the documented information necessary to enable traceability. Now let's talk about clause 8.5.3. The subclause 8.5.3 of ISO 9001 specifies that the organization is required to exercise care with property belonging to customers or external providers while it is under the organization's control or being used by the organization. As per this subclause, the organization is required to identify, verify, protect, and safeguard customers or external providers' property provided for use or incorporation into the products and services. Subclause 8.5.3 states that when the property of a customer or external provider is lost, damaged, or otherwise found to be unsuitable for use, the organization is required to report this to the customer or external provider and retain documented information on what has occurred. Within this subclause 8.5.3, it is also specified under a note that property of a customer or external provider can include materials, components, tools and equipment, premises, intellectual property, and personal data. Now, coming to subclause 8.5.4, preservation. As per this subclause 8.4, the organization is required to preserve the outputs during production and service provision to the extent necessary to ensure conformity to requirements. The subclause 8.4 says, under a note, that preservation can include identification, handling, contamination control, packaging, storage, transmission or transportation, and protection. Now let's talk about the subclause 8.5.5, post-delivery activities. This subclause 8.5.5 of the standard states that the organization is required to meet requirements for post-delivery activities associated with the products and services. In determining the extent of post-delivery activities that are required, the organization is required to consider statutory and regulatory requirements, the potential undesired consequences associated with its products and services, the nature, use, and intended lifetime of its products and services, customer requirements, customer feedback. Lastly, this subclause 8.5.5 says, under a note, that post-delivery activities can include actions under warranty provisions, contractual obligations such as maintenance services, and supplementary services such as recycling or final disposal. Coming to the next subclause 8.5.6, control of changes. The subclause 8.5.6, control of changes, states that the organization is required to review and control changes for production or service provision to the extent necessary to ensure continuing conformity with requirements. Clause further says that the organization is required to retain documented information describing the results of the review of changes, the person or persons authorizing the change, and any necessary actions arising from the review. Let's discuss the subclause 8.6. Release of products and services. The subclause 8.6 of ISO 9001 specifies that the organization shall implement planned arrangements at appropriate stages to verify that the product and service requirements have been met. As per this subclause, the release of products and services to the customer is required not to proceed until the planned arrangements have been satisfactorily completed by the customer or unless otherwise approved by a relevant authority and as applicable. The subclause further states that the organization is required to retain documented information on the release of products and services. The documented information must include evidence of conformity with the acceptance criteria and the traceability of the persons authorizing the release. Coming to subclause 8.7, control of non-conforming outputs. The subclause 8.7.1 of ISO 9001:2015 specifies that the organization is required to ensure that the outputs that do not conform to their requirements are identified and controlled to prevent their unintended use or delivery. As per the clause, the organization is required to take appropriate action based on the nature of the non-conformity and its effect on the conformity of products and services. This must also apply to the non-conforming products and services detected after delivery of products, during or after the provision of services. Subclause 8.7 says that the organization is required to deal with non-conforming outputs in one or more of the ways, like correction, segregation containment, return or suspension of provision of products and services, informing the customer, and obtaining authorization for acceptance under concession. Standard through this subclause states that conformity to the requirements is required to be verified when non-conforming outputs are corrected. Now, the subclause 8.7.2 states that the organization is required to retain documented information that describes the non-conformity, the actions taken, any concessions obtained, and identifies the authority deciding the action in respect of the non-conformity. Friends, I have explained the clause 8, operation of ISO 9001:2015. I sincerely thank you all for your interest and attention. Thank you and best wishes.